Hello to everybody who's watching this video. My name is Brett Ramhani, and I will be presenting my video presentation on the two movements in photography history known as Pictorialism and Dadaism. So, to begin, this is the first piece that I'll be discussing, but to give a brief background on what pictorialism is and what it's about. The beginnings of the story for pictorialism start with the birth of the invention for the first models of handheld cameras by Kodak in 1888. Ambitious artists and scientists with lots of funding and backing were no longer the only ones that were able to enjoy this new technology that allowed individuals to capture a moment in time. This new invention, in addition to photography, opened the doors for so many to partake in what was defined as pointing and shooting photography. Even though this new invention placed the camera in the hands of the average Joe, given its more affordable price tag, there were still small and persistent groups of people determined to make a name for themselves within this new medium. These small groups of people did not associate themselves with the group coined as the weekend snapshooters, but endured the hard route, requiring labor-intensive processes such as gum bichromate printing, which took artist paper and hand-coated them in emulsions and pigments and made them more fine artistic feel. The main mission statement that drove these pictorialists to pursue their movement was to prove that photography was not just a mechanical medium that anybody could do, but in fact it was a medium that could be utilized to create fine art. These pictorialists did still consider themselves amateurs, however, because they simply just cared deeply about the pursuit of creating art and not simple snapshots. Obviously, not just any photograph taken can be considered fine art. Some fine-tuning, pre-deliberation, and production processes incorporating the camera composition, subject, and lighting would create a delivery that only other critics could deem fine art. The principles revolving around this specific look of the earliest version of fine art photography challenged the artist to embrace and utilize the painting-like qualities of the new medium. Pictorialists also preferred to capture instead of document, meaning they shared little interest in recording visuals of modern life, but rather preferred to capture expressions, meanings, and moods through their unique camera works, compositions, and processes. They embraced using a softer focus, artistic and painter-like compositions, and incorporating romanticizing and idealizing imagery. Pictorialists stuck around post-production like an annoying persistent pest to make sure that their artwork was being demonstrated and presented to the public or critics in the correct and best manner. This meant attention to detail on how the artwork was presented, where it was placed, the size, the way it was mounted, and how it was framed and hung. For my first example, one of the most notorious artists involved within the pictorialist movement is Alfred Stieglitz, known as the editor of Camera Notes, which was the journal behind the Camera Club of New York. In an 1899 article, Stieglitz singled out the net mender as his favorite among his own pictures. He says, "It expresses the life of a young Dutch woman. Every stitch in the mending of the fishnet, the very rudiment of her existence, brings forth a torrent of poetic thoughts in those who watch her sit there on the vast and seemingly endless dunes, toiling with that seriousness and peacefulness which is so characteristic of these sturdy people." In addition to exclamate the notion of pictorialists taking importance to their display of their work, adding to the artistic expression, Stieglitz made sure that his print was very large to make sure that his subject expressed what it needed to. Another great example from the pictorialist movement and what it embodies is the flat iron by Edward Steichen. Made in 1904, the image subjects the newly built Flatiron Building at the time, which symbolized America's technological progression, as they considered the building as what the Parthenon was to the Greeks. The interesting juxtaposition in this composition is how Steichen pairs the natural landscape in the foreground with the human-made landscape in the back. With the nighttime fog, the rainy scene, and the dark silhouette of the person in the foreground, the image is something straight out of a dream, which accurately represents what the movement is all about. The subtle meaning behind the photo is not to document the new building, but to reference how these new developments in cities coincide with the destruction of nature and the environment, reminded by the tree in the foreground. For the last example, The Ring Toss by Clarence White. In 1899, this photograph captures the customs, values, and lifestyle of her small town life in Ohio before moving to New York. This photograph is the best example out of the three in how well a photograph in this movement could resemble painting-like qualities. The light orange gum bichromate of this print resembles pastel or red chalk, making the photographer's emulation of the traditions of art all the more salient. For the next photographic movement in discussion, it is called Dadaism, which found its place and setting in the world's time frame near the end of the Pictorialism movement and right at the beginning stages of World War I. It is said that without the war, there would have been no Dadaism, and that Dadaism explains the war better than the war explains Dadaism. Dadaism was centralized around the ideology that the war had mistaken men for machines. At this point in the world, it is important to mention that everyone's sense of reality and what reality was and meant was knocked off the rails, which the war did not help. A quote from Sigmund Freud states that the war at this time confused so many of the clearest intelligences, or so thoroughly debased what is highest. The Dadaism movement harped on this widely felt emotional notion, embraced it, and made fun of it through their artwork that introduced abstraction to a new level. Artists from this movement argued that the abstraction and demonstration of the dehumanization ripped off the meaning of what the war was intentional to remove the chance of subjectivity from the audience. No individuals from any audience could make any sense of what they were looking at, so then who was to say whether it was good or bad? The first great example from the Dadaism period is Hannah Höchst's piece Cut with a Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epoch of Germany. Made during 1919 to 1920, this piece makes a great combination and in that nature, a juxtaposition of both Dadaism and anti-Dadaism symbols, figures, and images compiled together. This is a great example of a trend within the movement to take images, cut them out, and place them accordingly or randomly to create collage pieces. Upon initial glance, the audience is faced with visual vomit and overstimulation and perhaps confusion, but with more time spent looking and less time spent thinking, a story starts to develop. A unique addition to this piece was the clippings of text that were placed, and it expedites the contextual understanding for the audience. This was quite new at the time. An example within the piece of the nonsensical combinations that were glued according to the Dadaism movement is Kaiser's iconic mustache that is replaced by two upside-down wrestlers, which can be seen in the top right around here. Another great example from the Dadaism movement comes from Marcel Duchamp, who created LHOOQ, which harps on the satirical nature from the movement. Specifically, this piece satirizes the meaning and value of fine art from the past. In this example, using the great Mona Lisa portrait that he was able to get from a cheap reproduced postcard, he waxes on a mustache and a goatee onto the woman, and clearly points fun by practically laying graffiti onto one of the most valuable pieces of art. Even the name of the piece is satirical to the great Mona Lisa, as the name's letters of the piece, LHOOQ, sound out words in French that translate to, she's hot in the butt. Finally, the last piece of discussion, Kurt Schwitter's Construction for Noble Ladies in 1919. This piece displays classic Dadaism objects, images, and collage construction. This abstract collage represents the mechanical motifs that were made during the movements that resembled the war times. This inorganic scrap of materials, objects, and color textures would be hard for many to consider art, which is exactly what the movement encapsulates and uses as fuel. For example, the rugged feeling from the combination of elements intentionally diverts from classic natures of fine art during the time. Finally, this is my works cited page. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you guys again soon. Thank you.